Well, thanks so much, folks, for being with us today. My name is Emilie Schario. Until recently, I was Director of Data at Netlify. Today, I'm a data strategist in residence at Amplify Partners, and I am so excited to be here with you all as part of the Open Source Data Stack Conference. I've got an incredible panel here with me today, and we're going to talk about lots of things. I'm excited to get in a room with a bunch of smart people and see where the conversation takes us. So Alex, why don't you kick us off? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Alex Dean, one of the two co-founders of Snowplow and also CEO. So I started Snowplow back in 2012 with Yali, my co-founder, and yeah, really excited to be here on the roundtable and at this event. Yeah, I'm based in London, UK, and it's probably enough about me. Over to Taylor.
Hi, yeah, I'm Taylor Murphy. I'm currently head of product and data at Meltano. Previously was working at GitLab as a staff data engineer. I'm living in Arlington, Texas right now. Over to Julia.
Hi, I'm Julia Schottenstein. I'm part of the product team at DBT Labs, which is the transform layer of the data stack. And before DBT, I was an investor at NEA, investing in a lot of data companies, one of which was Metabase. So starting off the show a little bit with a little bit of dynamicism, as we have Superset here as well. But over to you, Max, to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hey, so my name is Max. I'm the original creator of Apache Airflow and Apache Superset, as Julia mentioned. A few years back, I went on to start a company around Apache Superset named Preset, where we distribute and we contribute heavily to Superset and offer a managed service around it. I'm super passionate about just democratizing access to data in general, upping data literacy, and really like democratizing the whole analytics process to like beyond just like consumption of data. And with that, I'll pass it over to Brian.
I'm Brian Leonard, one of the co-founders of Grouparoo, open source reverse ETL tool. Before this, I was a technical co-founder at TaskRabbit, a way to get all kinds of things done in your house. Super glad to be here.
Love it. Love it. Like I said, you get a bunch of smart people in a Zoom room, so be it, and you can't have a great conversation. So really excited. We're going to start with a bit of a softball just to get everyone warmed up for the day. You know, data teams do such incredible work. I think what we're seeing is more and more companies know that they need data. They don't know exactly what that means, but they know they need data. So a friend comes to you, they say, friend, I'm starting a company. I know I need to hire a data person. What role should I hire? Where do you point them?
Maybe I'll take this one since it's a softball, but well, I think it's important to, when you hire an early company, you have to look at the skills you have and the skills you need. So one thing that informs who you should hire is the skills that you have today, and where you have a gap is probably where you want to hire. I think you need to cover the full stack, and the stack is pretty wide and deep too, but to get probably a player coach and someone who's pretty full stack, who can go and work from instrumentation to visualization and cover some grounds across the pipeline. If you have to pick just one role, I don't know which one that should be, so I'm going to leave that out for the next person.
I totally agree with that. I think full stack is the way to go. It's maybe a bit 90s, but we often call that persona like a data MacGyver, because they just kind of need to be able to do a bit of everything, be a bit dangerous across the whole stack. And you know, I don't think you can specialize too quick on that.
Yeah. My kids watch Carmen Sandiego now. I think is that up to date? Is that what it would be now?
They have a video game. I don't have kids that watch TV, so I don't know.
There you go. Sorry, Taylor, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not just going to say, I think the cheeky answer is it depends. It depends on the business. If you're a heavy data business, if you're like selling data or collecting it, you're going to need somebody a little bit more technical. But if you're starting a business and you understand the value of data, but maybe that's not the core competency of what the service you're offering or the product you're selling, you can get away with somebody who's maybe less full stack, but knows how to ask good questions, how to understand their weaknesses, and how to, like Max was saying, kind of backfill the skills that they probably don't have.
Yeah, I like to think about kind of like the data hierarchy of needs. Like people are always talking about the flashiest parts of analytics or machine learning, but before you can even run, you have to walk. And so thinking about someone that can just think about foundations, the first hardest part is just good reporting and getting your data in a usable format. And, you know, especially if you're starting from total scratch, you have to think about setting up the stack. And depending on where the investments you want to make, like that could be not so difficult or pretty difficult. So thinking about where you are as a company, but the first and foremost thing you want to think about is like, how do I just get the building blocks in place and who can handle that?
So it sounds like all good questions. The correct answer is it depends.
Exactly.
Yeah, we've maybe like Max said, we got pretty far with some of the open source tools we've been talking about here, and like using the DevOps skills we already have to get all of that kind of stuff running. And then the need starts showing itself, whether you're missing in-depth analysis or, you know, in-depth reporting or, you know, different ways to take action on the data. I think it's filling in the gaps.
One thing is for sure is without infrastructure and without like data collection mechanism or data in some sort of a queryable warehouse, you know, it's too early to go and hire analysts, right? So you need to work on that foundation, to Julia's point.
Yeah, and the context of the question was like, hey, I'm starting a company, but who you hire absolutely depends on the stage of your company as well. If you're a little bit more mature and you're like, oh man, we need a data proficiency in-house, you're gonna hire somebody very different. It's going to cost you a lot more probably than if you're just getting started with a small team.
Yeah. So it's the spicy take, don't hire a data person at all if you're really just starting out.
Hot take.
Make everybody a data person in your company.
Everybody, there it is. Everybody's a data person.
But the premise of the question too, it was a little bit loaded in the sense that it was like people don't know necessarily what they want. I've kind of experienced the opposite, where people are like, I'm going to need this, that, this, and I need these like, you know, 25 things to even get started, which might not be the right way to go either. Like, what is the foundation? What do you need to get started here?
Yeah, that's great. Okay, let's change pace a little bit. Y'all all represent different parts of the data stack, and specifically open source parts, alternatives to a lot of the tools in the data stack. One of the reasons that companies really think about open source as the ideal way to go is reducing vendor lock-in when they think about their stack. So why should a company care about vendor lock-in as they're building their data stack?
I think it's about, I don't know, flexibility and agility, and to being able to accomplish the use cases that you need to accomplish. And we've seen lots of cases where if you're not the source of truth, that means someone else is. And can you do what you want to do? A big example that I've seen a lot as I talk to people, especially that started really early. They started sending their events up to segments. Maybe Alex knows about these cases even better than I do. And then pretty soon that price keeps going up, and you can't really get it and use it how you want. And now you're having really different conversations like, do we really need to be sending all this data? And that's the opposite of spending that time to use it in a way that makes your company smarter.
Yeah, sorry,
go ahead, Alex.
Oh yeah, just a brief point on that. Yeah, I think the other thing I'd add, which is a bit surprising, is so when we started Snowplow, the lock-in thing wasn't such a big thing, but what people kept saying to us is that the lack of visibility into those proprietary systems, just the inability to see exactly how they were functioning and what they were doing, was really throwing people off, and they just couldn't get access to that versus just being able to pull up the code and seeing what was going on. So it's almost like kind of you're locked in from a kind of an auditability or visibility perspective. Sorry, Max.
Yeah, there's a term I haven't coined yet. I think that's like data sovereignty, right? It's the ability of your data team to be sovereign in regards of the tooling that they use. Open source helps a lot with that. You know, I think lock-in is like when stuff gets really hard, you know, you need to be able to take the reins and move on your own. But I think there's much more to data sovereignty too, right? There's like the ability to fix the bugs or fix the security issues that or the, you know, add the features you really care about. So the ability to extend and integrate, I think, is really great with with open source, right? Like you're not limited in terms of what you can do. And then lock-in is more, you know, if things, well, there are some cases where you just like, you know, with these vendors, the cost gets prohibitive, it gets really high, and then, you know, you're kind of stuck in a corner. And then if those vendors kind of know and use that, you know, against you in some cases.
Yeah, I mean, it creates this antagonistic relationship potentially with the customer as it, or with the users as time goes on. And yeah, absolutely all the points that y'all have mentioned. But you know, having an open source tool, I think, invites people into the ecosystem, into the development process of like, this is a tool that we want you to see and to build with us and to understand how it works. You get that better collaboration, both from a user and a customer perspective.
Yeah, I think that's like the side of the coin where it's not just vendor lock-in, but you get skill set lock-in. Like technologies are evolving so quickly. Like there's just such a rapid change of the software ecosystem that you almost, as a user or, you know, an analyst or analytics engineer or data engineer, whatever you want to call it, you'd rather invest your skill sets in open technologies or open standards, because you can take that transferable skill from one job to the next as well. And I think that's another kind of subtle power of having an open standard or open source nature of your technology in the analytics industry that's constantly evolving, and people are building their resumes and skill sets.
I totally agree. Oh, sorry. Go for it.
No, go ahead, Alex.
I was going to mention Singer. So I think for whatever reason, I think open source companies are just, maybe it's the DNA, they're just more likely to create open standards, document their APIs, like try and get a bit of a movement going around core protocols or core ways of doing things. And, you know, I think Singer is a really nice example of it. It came out of Stitch. Now there's like different vendors like Meltano who are taking it forwards, and like, I mean, Taylor, you can talk to this way better than me, but it just feels way safer for us all to be kind of working on that standard than, you know, a bunch of different super proprietary things. I don't know if that's your take on it.
Yeah, I was going to extend what Julie was saying, that it from a skills lock-in, it's also an interesting like competitive advantage for companies as well, where a lot of the different layers of the stack are still being kind of sussed out, and better ways of doing things, and being open and working in collaboration with the community like lets you be a little bit more flexible to incorporate better ideas than what's currently existing. To the Singer point too, I think we love the Singer ecosystem, and I think it's a really interesting avenue for data professionals who really aren't used to open source technologies. It's not in the ethos like it is for a lot of software engineers. And so the on-ramp to being able to contribute to an open source data ecosystem, I think can be easier with tools like Singer, where it's like, well, I don't know how to, you know, maybe commit to Apache Airflow in particular, but I know how to update this specific tab or this DBT package. And that's how I can dip my toes into kind of the open source ecosystem and give back. So I think it kind of opens the doors there for more people to be involved.
As a data leader, I see a lot of that skill set transfer when I hire data team members. So in my leadership time at Netlify, I hired 10 folks onto our data team. About half I hired with DBT. And on day one, with DBT experience from previous roles or from projects they had worked on, and on day one, they were able to contribute in a different way than people who had to learn DBT first. And I think a parallel that I've seen used a couple of times, including by Lori Voss on my team, who had to learn what DBT was that DBT is the Ruby on Rails of data transformation. Now there's just like a framework for how to approach these problems. And I think that is the skill set, the transferable skill set that Julia was talking about.
Well, it sounds like SQL is a big part of what DBT is, right? Like DBT is just a way to manage, you know, bags of templated SQL. So I think it does that very well. But the real, you know, maybe atomic skill, or the big part that really matters, is the ability to manage, you know, DAGs of SQL. Seems like a very important skill in this day and age.
Yeah, I almost think like in the data stack, and this is a little bit related, Taylor, to what you were saying, is like the benefits of open source, or the nuances or the differences are a little bit not the same for like software infrastructure. You needed to have open source and infrastructure because, like, well, teams aren't going to build anything on top of such a vulnerability of like revolving around a commercial company. You need to have the open source technology, and all the integrations end up being really hard. So you need to have more add-ons there. Like higher up in the stack, like the need for open source, I think, is slightly different in that it's creates promoting an open ecosystem, has open standards, like it's a more transparent way of working than perhaps we've seen in the past.
I think that fits really well what you're saying, Julia, is that with the, this is the modern data stack conference, and the way that the world has revolved, you plug and play these tools with your warehouse allows you to have the choice at each of those steps. And like, as James talked about in the keynote, like that could be proprietary things, but that also gives you the chance to have open source tools in there, and then have the transferability that you're talking about. The thing I really love, what I'm seeing, is by leveraging that warehouse and using the reverse ETL tool that we have, like they not only, because they own the data themselves, they're actually removing the lock-in they have to some mail provider that they don't really like. It's now easier to then take all that data and move to another provider. So it's not just even in your data stack, it's expanding out to all the tools that they're using.
Yeah, I think an interesting point, especially like the reverse ETL use case, is I map back onto mine and Emilie's experience at GitLab, where like we're super open with how we're doing everything. So all like our entire DBT code base was open, and you could see how, what sources we're pulling from, all the transformations. And I'm a big believer in like, the data is what's sensitive, like how you transform it, and kind of even some of the queries that you're running aren't even that sensitive. A less extreme example of that is just being open source, like even within your company. If your business users, if your sales team can understand, even if they don't understand SQL, but they can see like, okay, this is the table that's being moved into Salesforce, and it was synced at this time, and like it gives them that confidence that the data is accurate and up to date. And like at the end of the day, we're trying to give people confidence in the quality of their data and how they're using it to make decisions.
So building on top of that, Taylor and I, when we were at GitLab together, we wrote a DBT package around Snowflake spend, so you could get visibility into your Snowflake spend. And I think an easy entryway for a lot of contributions to open source in the data space, where you might have an analyst, an analytics engineer making a contribution, is building on top of the things. The tools, are building with the tools instead of contributing to the tool. How do you think of your community and your contributors as part of what you're building in your technology?
I think it's huge, right? If you take like the users on one front and the contributors, so people who contribute to the technology, versus the rest of the community of users and people using the technology. In some ways, it's different groups of people who care about different things. So sometimes we think about it as like almost like two different communities in some ways. Like I think there's some models too that are more like, oh, there's the core people to your community, and there's like more peripheral people, and then at some point there's like a community of users too. But we really want to encourage people to share more reference implementations and how they're using. Often it's not just one tool too, it's a combination of tools nowadays, like especially in this modern data stack that's fairly, I think fragmented is the right word, but it is a set of complex tools that intricately work together. So I think it's great to have these reference implementation. I would love to see a lot more of these, like your Snowflake cost analysis package. I don't know if it's been shared with a wider audience, but people are a little shy to go and share their DAGs, in parts because they're often very kind of intricately, coupled with their business problems and their other DAGs. But I would love to see a lot more of these reference implementation and frameworks shared. Like that was really my intention for Airflow. And we haven't seen as much of that, or we've seen very little of that, I think, in most communities.
So we at Snowplow, we've seen exactly kind of, Emilie, what you're describing, and it kind of surprised us in the early days. So we were expecting a sort of a Ruby on Rails style situation where the developers would be the users. There'd be this kind of really virtuous circle. And we found it was a bit different. So we found, we were building Snowplow in, really sort of serious functional Scala to make it really robust. And then the users of Snowplow were data scientists, data analysts, people writing a ton of SQL. And so we had that mismatch quite early on, and a ton of the Snowplow engineering is still dripping out of Snowplow the company. I think that the big thing we all have to think of as like open source software vendors is what are the, kind of similar to what Max is saying, what are the integration points? Where can we create kind of the extension layer where the community can get involved and can get much more creative? And we're doing a lot of work recently with DBT packages and building models on top of the data. We think we'll probably get a lot more from our community writing at that layer, because that's just closer to their day-to-day than the sort of the Scala code in the middle of the engine.
I think the definition for contributor is just totally misnamed when you're thinking about open source data companies. Like if you're only looking at GitHub contributors, like maybe that's not a great measure actually for how people contribute to open source data companies and projects. Reference architectures of course, but people are actually just so much more willing to help each other problem solve and like help each other because it is an open ethos, and it's almost like there should be a different way to measure contributor. It's not just every line of code that you've contributed to the actual repo, but are there other ways that you've given back and grown the ecosystem and made it much more richer because you're part of building it. And I think that we definitely have really healthy communities in data open source, but they might not fall under the same contributor definitions that we're all used to.
Yeah, practitioner and teaching is super big in the community, and debatably some blog tutorial is higher value than getting finding the semicolon that I missed at some point in the code.
No, or even like just letting the world know that you use the software is it's a very small contribution, but just to say like, hey, I work at company X and we use this open source package successfully is already pretty useful.
Get those logos.
Yeah,
it sounds to me like there's a spectrum here, right? Where there's people who are just talking, and then there's people who are actually maybe making PRs or MRs to your package, and there's people in between who are doing some variation of maybe they're in your Slack community but not talking, maybe they're in your Slack community and asking questions and answering other people's questions, and there's someone who liked your start your repo on GitHub or GitLab. Sounds like there's a spectrum. Sounds like managing community is 10 times harder if you have a spectrum like this. How are y'all approaching this problem?
I think Julia should take this one.
Yeah.
I think the people that think about community at DBT are wizards, but if you talk to the community team, like at DBT, they do things with two things in mind, which is like purpose, like why am I actually doing the thing? Like, how does this help? And then always give more than you get back. And it's this like pay it forward mentality that really just creates lots of benefits for our users. And that's why I describe it more of like a movement than, contributing something very tangible. It's like people are just has this flywheel of identifying and helping the community forward. And so there's lots of different use cases on like, how do you actually get people to contribute their skill set or contribute lines of code, contribute to community meetups, contribute to helping others. That's where there are probably more specific answers that someone will give you how to deal with each of those scenarios, but with those two principles of like, why are we doing the thing to begin with? And then always thinking about, giving more than you take has been our guiding principles in pretty much everything we do related to community.
I have a lot to say on this too. I think like one thing I've said in the past is like communities are built, one interaction at a time. So it takes a lot of interaction to grow this graph and create like all these edges, right, between people, and create like a real happy, tight graph of people. There's a real question for commercial open source companies of like, how do you develop this culture of like getting close to community and being like having every single person in the community, in the company, be at the support or some way like involved in the community. Recently, I think the company Orbit, they produce, I think they called it the Orbit model, which is like just a diagram, like looking at the concentric circles of the community. And maybe one way to think about it is like, how do you reach to all the spheres in the community, and you provide a way for people to get closer to the core, right? So thinking about like people in the different position, how they can get involved. It's not really this like concentric circle with cores. There's really like multiple, clusters there and multiple ways to contribute. Like the goal is not to get everyone to contribute to the open source project, but there's definitely like different pathways for different people to level up their contribution. Something to think about.
One model of leveling up that I've heard of that really stuck with me was like, how can we get people from like clicks to keyboards? Like if they're following and liking and like, these kinds of things, emojiing on Slack, like how can we get them to then ask a question or create an issue or a PR or write documentation or whatever it is. And that's one way that we've thought about it.
So it does sound to me like your community of people who are not making pull requests or merge requests to your code base is much bigger than the people who are. How do you build that community without ostracizing your software code contributors?
I'm not sure that's a problem.
Yeah, I think they're looking for different things. I think the wider community, Emilie, is looking for, to develop themselves with this technology or in this community, make those connections, be productive, and I think, and learn fundamentally. And then I think what we've seen with kind of pull requests and GitHub contributors is they're very task oriented. They want to solve something that's wrong in the product. There's a bug, there's a missing feature that they just need, and that's and it's faster to do it through a pull request. So I think it's pretty I think it's doable, serving both communities, both populations.
Nice.
I think we have a unique problem, a little bit a preset to, or not a challenge, I'd call it, is the fact that the users of Superset they're not developers, they're not engineers. A lot of them are just people. They sit anywhere within the company, and they're not necessarily the channels that we have for community like GitHub and Slack. They're not super natural to these users too. There's a question of how do we best serve the users of Superset as a community, and I think one way that we do that is by providing the tools to the advocates, to the people that are like really care about deploying Superset successfully in their organization. Like how do we give them things that they can pass on to the users too? And there's a question longer term, like how do we create a healthy community of users there too?
Yeah, I think one thing that we're thinking about at Meltano as well around community is also that like there are, it's not just the users, and it's not just kind of the open source individuals. There are companies and consultancies that use Meltano and use all of these other products and help deploy them. And we see them as a vital part of the community as well. And so we've had great conversations with people who they want to become experts on Meltano. They want to deploy it for their customers, and they also want to give us that feedback and potentially contribute features back as well. And we see that as being a valuable part of the larger community. And then they'll also be involved in the Slack channels in answering questions. And that I think is, at least from just a pure data professional perspective, being involved and going on to like the DPT Slack and somebody has a question, you go and answer it, like, oh, I solved this problem, here's how I did it. And then if you work at someplace like GitLab or Meltano, here's a link to the code as well, which is really fun.
Hey, I totally agree. I think those data boutiques, I won't say any by name because I'll get slacked by one of the other ones I didn't mention, but like they're like the unsung glue of this stack, the open source stack for sure, other parts of the stack as well, right? Like without them kind of bringing it all together and saying, no, trust me, we can solve this, this business problem for your company with these tools, like it'd be way harder for all of us.
Absolutely.
Back to the code people though. I think we left these people out. Like, I think one of the most exciting things about open source, especially probably with Grouparoo and Meltano, is this notion that there are approximately like infinite connectors that these things need to connect with. And so, you know, we've implemented the ability to connect to MailChimp and Marketo and Zendesk, but there's the equivalents in Vietnam and Brazil. And I've talked to people in these places, and like that's like number 7,000 on the list of any given non-open source commercial US enterprise. And I'm just, I don't know, I think it's super exciting to get contributions at that like connector level. What have you seen, Taylor?
Yeah, honestly, that was a big part of the pivot that our CEO took in last year was when we focused more on the ELT side of things. Part of what he cited is that, you know, our experience, especially as like US based companies, is not the global experience for a lot of these tools. And being open source, having a great free version of the product does democratize the best practices of our profession to a wider audience and to a wider global community. And that's, yeah, absolutely. Like no company can possibly create or manage all of the potential connections that are out there. And especially if in a healthy economy, there's new companies being started and new APIs and new connectors, and like there has to be a collaborative aspect and open community part to all that. So that's 100% of like how we view and think about open source as part of our business.
And I was actually, now that I think about it, I was talking with James from the keynote, and he says that actually most of his data is internal weird stuff too, and open source can use the same connectors, so to speak, if you've got something going on that's not anything I've ever heard of either, which is really
cool. That enterprise use case, that like self-hosted enterprise use case exists, is large. A lot of people don't talk about it because these are like, you know, behind the scenes B2B conversations for a lot of people. But yeah, there's always going to be some weird database that you don't want to send data over the public internet, and you need some sort of self-hosted connector, and maybe it's like an old version of Mongo or something that doesn't work with the modern connector. And like no company is going to, unless you pay them a lot of money, is going to solve that for you, but like you can solve it yourselves. And I think it's very empowering to have an open source tool across the stack.
Okay, changing gears a little bit here. Y'all know that I love to say tools are great, but the hardest part of data is definitely people problems. Especially, I think, as we think about creating more data-driven companies, we really have to consider data literacy and how we teach more people how to use data. How do we fit and leverage these tools and our open source data stack into our mission around data literacy?
Maybe I'll take this one and talk a little bit from experience of so I worked at like I would call them, you know, data forward companies in the past. Like so Facebook had a huge program called Data Camp that they probably still have today, that would essentially give access to anyone in the company, not just in data teams or specific teams or specific roles. Anyone in the company could get enrolled in Data Camp, and that was a multi-week program where you would learn not only about all the tools that you could use at Facebook to pretty much like do anything related to the analytics process as a whole, from instrumentation to consumption, and learn about the tools, but learn also about how to use the internal data dictionaries, how to find the right data sets, which key data sets like everyone at Facebook should know about. So Facebook was pretty great about that at the time. And then Airbnb took on something similar, like reading from that playbook. And we had Data University. There's been some articles published about this too. So similar program where pretty much anyone in the company can jump in, learn tooling, learn a little bit of SQL, learn how to find the data structures that are relevant for themselves and their team. And I think that's certainly one way to do it. Then there's a question of how do we do that as a community too? Is that, you know, the role of the organization that people sit in? Is that the role of, you know, open source communities? Probably it's a shared role to help with that.
Yeah, I think that's right. Like, it's not fair to ask everyone to be an analyst or everyone to learn SQL, but we are seeing transformations, and just data is important. People want to be data forward companies and use it to make decisions. I think the biggest shift that we're seeing in the industry is just how we consume data. So it's, of course, you have your dashboards and reporting, and that's usually the first step that people take in becoming a data literate company. But then there's all these next steps that we're taking as well of like, how do we integrate insights into our apps or bring data into context where you're making decisions? And it's almost, that's the first step of pointing to relevant stats or relevant information, relevant data, just to have baseline muscle repetition of what are these numbers, what do they mean, before you can then take action or make insights. It's like these muscles that you have to continually grow. And one of the best, I think, shifts that we've seen is like bringing data to the people in their workflows and not making it prohibitively hard for people to become analysts themselves, but just surfacing the nugget of information they need to make a decision or to know what's going on, just getting visibility.
I agree that visibility is super powerful. At TaskRabbit, we saw when we implemented a BI tool that allowed browsing of the data, a lot of misunderstanding about what these fields mean for sure. After we got past that, we see our operations teams like answering their own questions and finding their own insights around who, for example, they should celebrate as the best taskers and who can really help the rest of the community grow, all from fairly low level tables when you really get down to it, but with a little bit of literacy and the right access, and to some degree an expectation that every question isn't always for the analyst. We saw that go a really long way.
It's cultural.
For sure.
I think jumping back to Julia's point about kind of taking the data to the operational systems, to the kind of line of business teams, I think that's so powerful. I think that's one of the really powerful things about reverse ETL now is instead of sort of trying to get those really busy line of business teams into kind of central reporting, you just enrich their UIs, you enrich their Salesforce or their Gainsight or whatever with the right insights for them that you've kind of pulled out of your central warehouse. It's pretty cool.
Yeah,
that's good. I like that.
This ties in a little bit to the talk that Emilie and I had given back at Coalesce last year around like having that kind of product lens of like what are your users care about? What are the jobs that your users are trying to do, and how can you bring the data to them? How can you bring the visibility to them? And having that kind of product lens on kind of the whole data stack, I think is powerful because it centers the end user. It doesn't necessarily center any particular tool, but it also elevates the data profession and says like you need people who are able to guide users to think about systems and processes and to build them in such a way that they add value for your colleagues and customers.
I think this is going to be a huge trend, over the next like 5 to 10 years too, of like, so we've had all sorts of like general purpose tooling. Like we work at Preset and as part of the Preset community on general purpose tooling. BI historically has been very much like successful as a general purpose type tool to visualize whatever data you might have. But we're going to need a lot more special purpose tooling or for data to infiltrate all of the data apps, all the products that exist today. I think that we're going to see every product become essentially a data product more and more. And there's a question of like how we bring that data to the right data to the right person, the right time. And we're interested in that in terms of like embedded BI and how do we make Superset also an open platform to build data products in some ways to bring the right visualization and the right data in the right place.
That gap that you guys were talking about a little bit was that between like the end users, say the marketers or the salespeople, and the engineers was like the inspiration for TaskRabbit. Basically, I was in charge of the engineering team and the data team, and the marketers would come and say, we need this. And I was like, I don't know what to tell you. The engineers really don't like working on what you're saying. And a big part of that was Marketo's API. But the second big part of that was that they didn't really know how. It was the exact opposite of what I just talked about, which is like, what are these weird fields? Like, I don't know what this is. Like, you want me to sync a bunch of random stuff over there? Okay, I guess. And it's that they needed a place to come together. And so I applaud like anything that like gets the engineers to get the right data, but then in our case, the marketers or the salespeople can then interpret that correctly. I think that's the same for BI, and I think that's the same for analysts embedded, like usually analytics engineers on those teams. I think it's a really, I don't know, like it's people, like you said, it's a relationship there between that and having a concrete understanding of each other and a place to meet that is super successful.
To be clear, though, I think the question that like Emily brings up is a really fair and good one, because it's not going to only be solved by tooling, and anyone who says it's a tooling only solution is missing it. It's really organizational and cultural, and you have to start elevating your teams to bring data to the conversation, celebrating when decisions are made with data, giving people baseline understanding of what's normal, what's expected. And so it's too often like we think about it as like only solved with tools, and that's just only half the battle. It's much more about, I think, getting the right tools and the right philosophy on how do you want to make data a secret weapon in making decisions at your company.
I do think that tooling, it really very much implies certain ways of working though, right? Like DBT, when you start incorporating it, it's like, okay, well, I suddenly have files. Oh, I might as well version control this so I can have pull requests so I can collaborate around that. And then it's like, well, you can add testing, you can add documentation. And so it's like, how do you, one of the things I love about DBT is it encourages people to incrementally adopt best practices in a way that's less intrusive than just saying like, everything has to go through this ERP and here's 20 different fields that you have to fill out. And it invites people into kind of building a process that makes sense for them and they understand why they're doing something. But Alex, I cut you off.
No, I think that's spot on, Taylor. I think what you're describing is kind of progressive. You just kind of you layer it on over time. I guess I was just thinking about this data discoverability challenge, and it's coming up a lot with our users and our customers. And I guess each of us as vendors is thinking about what can we do to help. But to the tooling point, I'm wondering if, like when we do this conference again next year, will there be like an open source data catalog or kind of metric store or something joining us? Like, do we need a whole vendor or a whole category of vendors like thinking about this, or do we all just need to do our part for like discoverability and kind of communication?
No, I think that's a super important and interesting topic. I don't know if we want to take the tangent, but a few things is there are open source projects there. So there's there's Data Hub, there's Amundsen, and there's probably a lot more projects coming through. But I think the metadata exchange is a real topic too, like whether that goes through a hub in the shape of a data dictionary or some sort of data graph that centralizes the metadata, or whether like just all of our tools communicate with each other with some sort of like metadata exchange standards. There's Open Lineage, there's Datakin in that space.
Max went down the road of naming people. Now he's got to make sure he gets them.
Now you could name everyone.
Well, I don't know, but I think we should. I think like part like just knowing what exists is half the battle, or it's a good place to start. So but I do think that one thing that's really important is to have like some sort of like structure around metadata exchange. And then the people driving that conversation right now are the data dictionary, data graph type projects and companies behind them, which I think is important. How do we get DBT to talk with Superset and Meltano to talk to like whatever tool it's working on top of is really important topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, I guess the question I'd have there is, for every new category that we're seeing invented in the closed source world, do you think a parallel open source tool will pop up?
Yes.
I reckon so.
And every open source tool that pops up, someone will also commercialize it. So, it all ends up in the same.
Works both ways.
It's in both directions.
Yeah, I mean, there's like a typical cycling of bundling and unbundling in software generally, right? And I think data is generally an unbundling side of things. I think Meltano takes the stance that we are trying to bundle some things and we're pretty early to the game. But I think that cycle of bundling and unbundling does exist in the software space and in data as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think to Max's point, like if we're all missing though a kind of a metadata standard, so all our systems can talk to each other and we don't have to directly integrate point to point with a lot of stuff. We can just speak to the metadata standard or whatever, like we've had with SQL, like we've had with schema technologies. Then it's kind of in everyone's interest, and definitely in the interests of the poor data teams that have to implement all this stuff, that we all get together and adopt a sensible standard on some of this stuff.
Yeah, if the future of the modern data stack, is to be open source and to be kind of a lot fragmented in some ways, or a loosely coupled ecosystem of like really strong, product offerings in different verticals, then it's vital for this offering to work well together that we have some standards and metadata exchange, right? So I do think that's the direction that we're going with this, or that the industry is going, right? It won't be a big platform as a service that kind of gobbles up everything. I think it will be really strong ecosystem of tools that are pretty good at a variety of things that work well together, that integrate well together.
And with the data warehouse at the middle, I think we've gotten this well already, because like tables and schemas and in general, like if they're communicating through that shared data layer, but it's a structured thing. And so we've been able to make do for a while. Maybe there's a lot longer to go for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the warehouse, because that's the one piece of this conference, of this conversation, that really isn't represented, and there really isn't as far as I know, like a great open source data warehouse. There's a few we can
some
name,
of the people that
like,
emailed me since we announced this might say differently, so but
yeah,
I mean
that's fair, but like coming into data, there's some big proprietary players, right?
Yeah,
I'm confident that there will be the Postgres or the MySQL of data warehouses at some point, but yeah, I think that's a kind of a weakness.
That's a very dynamic area, like this area, like between, there's there's two Presto company, Presto Trino, which arguably, are very solid execution engine for a data warehouse probably on top of a lake. But then there's the Druid, ClickHouse, Firebolt. I'm sure I'm forgetting like 2 or 3 that are like these, in memory, real time, super fast analytics database that are super great. So I'm really happy to see that, because analytics at the speed of thought is really important for analysts to be able to slice and dice the data in a way that doesn't take minutes to get answers to their query is really important.
In a similar vein, so as we're getting nitty gritty into technologies there, one of the big criticisms of open source is that it can require a lot of like engineering of your team members. And as we think about bringing data to more of the company, how do we reconcile these kind of things that could be seen as counter?
Are you asking like in the deployment, or specifically in interfacing with the tool to get their answers? Because I think there's different paths for this question.
I guess it depends on what tools you bring in, right? So you tell me.
Are you saying like the cost of ownership of open source is high? How do we address this? Or like operating open source software is expensive?
Yeah, it seems one of the criticisms that I hear a lot around open source is that the tools can seem so engineering-y, they're off-putting to people. For example, to get started with dbt, you need a sense of what version control and that all is. And if you don't know, maybe that can scare people away from adopting dbt.
It's like concentric layers of like who owns what part of the stack, and it's okay to have more governance, more engineering like workflows in certain areas. And so I think about it like maybe storage, governance, and consumption. There's a reason why people have moved towards more engineering workflows for lower in the stack, or things that come before the consumption piece. And it's because you need a level of like making sure your data quality is high and that things are always running and always on. And there's a lot of best practices that you can look towards from software development that just work. I think the consumption piece, and it gets a little bit to what I was saying before, it's like you can't expect everyone to even know SQL or know analytics. And that's when you want it to be really palatable and digestible for a really big audience, people who don't have engineering or technical backgrounds at all. Because if you don't accomplish that, then you haven't really met the goal of serving your end user. So I think it just really depends where in the stack you are. Consumption, you definitely don't want that to be a barrier or limiting by the technical skill sets that you might have, but maybe a little bit downstream, it's okay because you're building something very scalable for people to consume.
Yeah, I actually thought this question was going to have how it's so awesome that maybe I'm just too much of an engineer, that the data world is moving towards being more software engineering, like Julie is talking about. And I think that's super amazing, as like you can accidentally email a whole bunch of people now if you have a reverse ETL tool in case. It's not just a really bad report anymore. HBO not using Grouparoo. So now you have staging environments and tests and all this other stuff going on. And I think that's amazing. It's that consumption piece that Julie's talking about, that handoff. And I'm sure Max thinks a lot about it with his different end users. And we think a lot about it in providing the data, serving it up to that spot where then maybe the marketing team can then map that to MailChimp. And it's definitely a valid criticism that our UI is a little less polished than various probably more commercial offerings, but that notion of, again, that human workflow, I think, is a big part of it, and who owns what.
There's a huge tangent there that I will just point to. I'm not going to take to, but how is it that open source tooling is struggling up the stack? Right. So I think open source has been really great down the stack for infrastructure. But as you get to build UIs, I think my answer to that is I think we have not succeeded yet at bringing product managers and product designers as part of the open source process, which we're trying to crack very actively, in our community. I think it's really key. And probably, Brian, if you want to have a better UI, you're gonna have to figure out how to bring these people in the fold and get them to be an active part of your community. Too, but back to the original question, I'm gonna send it back to Taylor.
Yeah, I think having tools that allow people to kind of punch through to the code and have the nice UI, but then there's something that they can see behind the scenes when they need to dive in. We're kind of the opinion that data engineers are going to start evolving into these data stack developers, and so it's less about, okay, I need to connect with a random API, and it's more about I need to build the infrastructure that ensures the high quality, testing and confidence building across the stack. I'm actually of the opinion that YAML is fantastic and is it's terrible, but everything else is worse. But it's a great interface for non-technical people to interact with different layers of the stack. We saw this work. Of course, I'm going to lean on GitLab for this, but we saw this work really well at GitLab. People can, with a few minutes of training, can understand YAML, and it works really well. Maybe don't have everybody look at YAML plus Jinja. That starts to throw them for a loop. But there are these interfaces that tie kind of the human aspect to the job that they're trying to do to the more technical, scalable, automated systems that engineers want and need to build. I don't know if that's controversial, but I love YAML. So
I don't think it's controversial. I think your point about punch through is really important, Taylor. So Max is right. We all in the open source kind of vendor community, we need to be developing those great UIs that don't feel like there's a bunch of raw open source under the hood. But the punch through is really powerful. I remember in the early days of Snowplow when we were setting it up for new customers, they said, "Oh, is there an API to get at my events?" And we were like, "No, you don't need an API. All the events are just available in real time in your Kinesis stream." And they were like, "Oh, okay. So there's actually just there's a bunch of stuff that proprietary software needs that actually open source running in your own account just doesn't need." So the punch through to kind of lift the lid and get underneath and actually get at the code and the engine is really powerful, but it doesn't mean we don't need to be creating those way simpler kind of UIs on top.
I want to react real quick to just templated YAML, templated SQL is kind of what we elected to manage our mountains of ETL logic nowadays. And I'm both this is what I would select today if I was to write, a shit ton of ETL for a whole week. But I'm kind of disappointed that it's kind of what we settled on. in some ways too, right? Like, you know, should it be like more programmatic in some ways and construct that are easier to you know, build abstraction on top of and to share. You know, templated SQL, like mountains of, like I have nightmares. I wake up in the middle of the night thinking about mountains of templated SQL and how easy it is for people to add a layer to that mountain. And that still, you know, grows into a big pile of unmanageable stuff. And it prevents people like us to share reference implementation that can be reused, right? Because when I pass over a bunch of template SQL to you, you're like, oh, you know, what can I do with that? It's kind of a tough thing, but it's probably a big tangent here too.
Well, yeah, we need to get Ben Stansel on here so y'all can fight.
Sounds like a call to arms.
Yeah.
I think overall, a really, like an end state, I don't know, there's no end state, a really great step that I'm seeing across many of these things and almost in the software engineering, product engineering world as well, is what I'd call all of the things you're saying, which is like declarative configuration or something like that. And so you just say how you want your pipeline to work, and then it's our job for the tools to make that happen. And so, you know, in Grouparoo, you can use the UI, but if you, that'll also output JSON. I mean, YAML's junk, but JSON's great, obviously. And then you can check that in and run your tests and all that other stuff. But the point here is, in the same way that you know, DBT is declarative in that SQL, Ginger or not, it's up to the more advanced tooling that we're creating to have someone declare what they want, and then, you know, we make it happen. That's what democratizes in a lot of ways.
All right. I think there's a lot that people are going to be able to take from this conversation and kind of move to next steps with. Thank you all so much. Before we wrap up though, I want to end on something in the data space you're loving right now. So something you've read or watched or listened or bought that you're just loving and you want to share. And I'll give you all a minute to think while I share mine. Wonderful former team member of mine, Paige Berry, recently published on Locally Optimistic a blog post about sharing your data insights with your colleagues. We were able to have a really wonderful impact doing this at Netlify, and just having a dedicated Slack channel focused on insights has been really wonderful, or was really wonderful for us. Paige put this blog post together and put it out into the world, and we've had really great feedback. So I'm really loving Paige's article right now. Julia, what's on your love right now list?
I'm glad I got to go for early in the chain, but I've been really enjoying Ben Stansel's blog. It sounds like lots of people here have been reading his Friday fights, but there's a lot of rich information and interesting Ben thoughts for everyone to read. Oh, and over to Max.
I'm trying to dig out the link to an article I read recently. So if you can get back to me in a moment.
Will do. I'll go next then. We're doing a book club at our company, and we're currently reading 97 things every data engineer should know. A couple pages each. You know, different things for different people, but all pretty good. So recommend it.
So is everyone reading a couple of pages and then you're all sharing?
No, I made a spreadsheet.
Do you read them out to each other?
Oh yeah, they're bedtime stories, Alex. That's what we're doing. You're right, like metadata bedtime stories for sure. And we're storing, of course, like when we go to. Never mind. All right. Anyway, we're reading them all and highlighting the ones we want to talk about, and then we talk about a couple every week.
Nice. What about you, Alex? Anything special there lately?
Yeah, so I guess Max wakes up with cold sweats about YAML. At Snowplow, we think a lot about kind of very heterogeneous JSONs and how to get them into warehouses. It can be difficult. So I've been really enjoying the Firebolt guys have just come out with this white paper on semi-structured analytics, and it seems the way they've architected it, Max mentioned them earlier, seems really cool. So I've been reading up on that. Back over to Taylor.
Yeah, so I'm going to cheat a little bit and probably name two things because one's non-data related. But I recently joined Reforge to kind of improve my skills on the product side of things because I'm relatively new to leading a product organization. And it's, I think what's really cool about that, and I promise this ties into data, talking with other people who are in different industries, have different skill sets and are kind of coming into this community for different purposes. It's made me recognize and like really appreciate how having a very diverse background sometimes makes some of the best data professionals. And I think it's really cool to see just the data profession growing and more people wanting to use data because you just bring more people in and learn more from a lot of different people. So that's been fun. And then the data specific thing that I'm like thinking a lot about and I'm curious to I want to play with is the open source headless BI or metrics layer. There's a company Metriquel that they've got an open source offering that I think looks pretty cool. Of course, I'm thinking about how to integrate this stuff with Meltano, but just in general, I think it when I first read that headless BI article, it really clicked something in my brain, and I think it did for a lot of people. And I'm very curious to see how this area grows. So they've had Metriquel had a recent blog post as well that I think is worth checking out on kind of metrics layer and OLAP cubes. And then Max.
Yeah, on my side, so the article I will share for the show notes, but there's this great article around data apps and to what we talked about a little bit earlier, how we're going to bring interactive data visualizations to all sorts of products and apps. So there's a good looking out at everything that exists today, from embedded BI to SDK to your notebooks transformed that as mini applications, right? We've seen the emergence of the R Shiny type of derivatives in the Python world too. So I'll share the link to that. I think it's very interesting. And to another point that we talked about, which is metadata standards and exchange. So encourage people to look at open lineage as a standard, an emerging standard in this space. And I believe there's a new one to call open metadata. So take a look and see what that means for the tooling you use today.
Nice. Well, thanks, y'all. I think it's always so great to hear and read the things that other people are reading because it really elevates the conversations we can have. I know my team talks about Ben's newsletter on Monday during our weekly team meeting. Thank goodness it comes out on Friday. As we wrap up here, let's tell people where they can find you if they want to keep the conversation going. Why don't we start off with Max? Max, where can people find you? Twitter, social, etc.
Yes, I'm Mr. Crunch on Twitter. You can find me too on the Superset Slack, probably good places, and just anywhere around the Superset community.
And Brian?
Yeah, the email, Brian at Grouparoo, on Twitter at bleonard. Any given Slack that we're all in. Super happy to chat anytime. How about Alex?
Yeah, any given Slack, they're all in. I'm Alex at snowplowanalytics.com, and my Twitter is AlexCRDean. That's catchy, isn't it? On Twitter. What about over to Taylor?
Yeah, any of these Slack groups, DBT or Locally Optimistic is probably the biggest ones. I'm Taylor at Taylor A. Murphy on Twitter. Lots of fun on Twitter. And Taylor at meltano.com as well for email. Julia?
And I'm Julia Schottenstein on the DBT Slack, and you can find me on Twitter at J_Schottenstein. Best of luck trying to spell my last name. It's a long one.
It's on the screen right now. No problem.
That's true. I forgot we got visuals. Yeah.
What about you, Emily? Where can people find you?
I am Emilie with an IE, Schario, SCHARIO on Twitter. I would love to keep the conversation going if people have questions or want to just kind of, there's a lot we still have to figure out. This is only the first open source data stack conference. There's going to be hopefully a lot more players in this space represented next time. I'm really excited to see what evolves between now and then. So thanks so much for sharing a bit of your time with us today, folks. We're going to hang out in Discourse and answer questions for the next little bit. And it's been wonderful. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emily.